Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a world where the simple act of buying bread could cost you your life savings, your dignity, and possibly a few fingers. Picture this. You're standing at the edge of a medieval marketplace as the first pale rays of dawn creep over thatched roofs and crooked timber frames. The air is thick with wood smoke, animal waste, and something that might charitably be called ode to unwashed humanity. You can hear the distant lowing of cattle, the squeal of cartwheels on cobblestone, and the aggressive shouting of vendors already marking their territory like particularly entrepreneurial wolves. You probably think you do just fine in this rustic shopping experience after all. How hard could it be to buy some cheese and maybe a nice loaf of bread? Well, buckle up, because you're about to discover that surviving a single day in a medieval market would make your worst Black Friday experience look like a peaceful meditation retreat. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing our little community span the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've made your first crucial mistake already, and you haven't even entered the marketplace proper. You see, in medieval times, the concept of first come, first served existed about as much as the concept of indoor plumbing, which is to say, not at all. The prime selling spots in any market weren't claimed by arriving early. They were inherited, purchased, fought over, or granted by local authorities who had been thoroughly bribed with the finest Alesh and mysterious meat pies. As you approach what looks like a perfectly reasonable empty space near the market center, you're already being sized up by Martha the fishwife, who has been selling herring from this exact spot since before you were born, and whose great-grandmother probably sold herring from this spot during the Crusades. Martha doesn't need to say anything. Her steely glare and the way she's casually sharpening her gutting knife while maintaining unbroken eye contact tells you everything you need to know about your territorial ambitions. The established vendors have a system, and you are decidedly not part of it. These aren't weekend farmers market hobbyists selling artisanal honey and handmade soaps. These are professional merchants whose families have been working these markets for generations, and they view newcomers with all the warmth typically reserved for tax collectors and plague victims. The market hierarchy is as rigid as the class system itself, and you, my friend, are starting at the very bottom of a very tall ladder. You quickly realize that the available spaces are available for very good reasons. There's a lovely spot right next to the public latrinian. Yes, medieval markets had communal toilets that were basically holes in the ground with wooden seats. If you were lucky, the aromatic experience of setting up shop there would ensure that your goods, no matter how appealing, would carry a certain je ne sais quoi that would make customers hurry past with handkerchiefs pressed firmly to their noses. Then there's the spot directly downwind from the butcher's stall, where the combination of blood, offal, and decomposing meat scraps creates an olfactory assault so powerful it could probably be classified as a weapon under the Geneva Convention. If the Geneva Convention existed and if anyone cared about your suffering, which they decidedly do not. The medieval butcher doesn't believe in refrigeration because it hasn't been invented yet. And he certainly doesn't believe in disposing of waste in what you might call a sanitary manner. Your modern sensibilities are already being tested, and you haven't even unpacked your hypothetical medieval wares yet. The marketplace is beginning to fill with people, and you're starting to understand that this isn't just a place of commerce, it's a complex social ecosystem with rules, hierarchies, and customs that have evolved over centuries. Think of it as a medieval LinkedIn network, except instead of awkward professional connections, everyone's armed and potentially dangerous. The market square itself tells a story of controlled chaos. The cobblestones are worn smooth in some places and treacherously uneven in others, creating ankle-twisting hazards that the locals navigate with practiced ease while you stumble like a newborn calf wearing ice skates. Wooden stalls and temporary structures seem to have sprouted organically from the stone, each one precisely positioned to maximize foot traffic while minimizing encroachment on neighboring territories. Medieval markets were typically held once or twice a week, usually on specific days granted by royal charter or local lords' permission. These weren't casual gatherings, they were serious economic events that required official approval, taxation, and regulation. The fact that this market exists at all means someone with considerable power decided it should exist, and that same someone collects a tidy profit from every transaction that takes place here. Historians still argue whether medieval market layouts were carefully planned by town authorities or simply evolved through years of territorial disputes and practical necessity. But what's clear is that every inch of space serves multiple purposes. The area near the church steps isn't just convenient for customers, it's also where official announcements are made, where debtors are publicly shamed, and where the occasional heretic might be displayed as a cautionary tale. You notice that the vendors aren't just arranging their goods, they're performing elaborate territorial rituals. Blankets are spread with mathematical precision. Wooden boards are positioned to create clear boundaries, and merchandise is arranged not just for display but as a kind of fortress wall protecting each vendor's claim space. Thomas the baker doesn't just set out his loavesh, creates a bread barricade that clearly delineates where his domain begins and ends. The social dynamics are becoming apparent as well. There's a clear hierarchy among the vendors, and it has nothing to do with the quality of their goods or their business acumen. Age plays a role, as does family history in the trade, but there are subtler factors at work. The spice merchant, despite being relatively young, commands obvious respect, probably because spices were literally worth their weight in gold, making him essentially the neighborhood millionaire. A single pound of black pepper could cost as much as a decent horse, and exotic spices like cardamom or cinnamon were so valuable that they were sometimes used as currency themselves. Meanwhile, the elderly woman selling herbs and questionable remedies is treated with a mixture of reverence and suspicion that suggests her wares might be more potent than they appear. Medieval medicine was a fascinating blend of legitimate herbal knowledge and pure superstition, and the line between healer and witch was often determined more by local politics than actual effectiveness. You're beginning to realize that simply having something to sell doesn't make you a merchant any more than owning a sword makes you a knight. These people are professionals operating in a complex economic and social system that you're only beginning to glimpse. The casual way they interact, the shorthand conversations, the meaningful looks exchanged across the square all speaks to a community that functions according to rules you don't understand and customs you've never learned. The morning light is growing stronger, and more customers are beginning to trickle into the market. You watch as the established vendors greet regulars with familiarity, adjust their prices based on who's buying, and navigate complex negotiations that seem to involve not just money but social obligations, family connections, and promises of future favors. Medieval commerce wasn't just about exchanging goods for coins, it was about maintaining relationships, honoring debts, and participating in a complex web of mutual obligations that could span generations. Meanwhile, you're still standing there like a lost tourist, clutching whatever goods you've brought to sell and slowly realizing that you've entered a world where commerce is warfare, reputation is currency, and making a single wrong move could leave you bankrupt, homeless, or worse. The other vendors are starting to notice you now, not with curiosity or welcome, but with the calculating gaze of predators who have spotted potential prey. Your clean clothes are the first giveaway. Medieval people didn't have closets full of outfits, and most owned perhaps 2 or 3 sets of clothing total. The fact that you're wearing something that isn't patched, stained, or worn thin immediately marks you as either wealthy, foreign, or completely ignorant of local customs. None of these options work in your favor when you're trying to blend in and avoid attention. Your uncertain posture is the second giveaway. Everyone else moves through the market with purpose and confidence, knowing exactly where they're going and what they're doing. You, on the other hand, are clearly confused about basic market protocols, and confusion in medieval times was often fatal. It suggested you were either mentally deficient, criminally suspicious, or dangerously naive again, none of these being particularly helpful for your survival prospects. The medieval marketplace operated on what we might call primitive networking. Everyone knew everyone else's business, family history, and reputation going back several generations. Strangers were inherently suspicious because they represented unknown quantities in a world where trust was literally a matter of life and death. Without family connections, guild membership, or local references, you were essentially a walking target for every scam, theft, and confidence trick in the medieval playbook. As the sun climbs higher and the market begins to hit its stride, you're faced with your first real decision. Attempt to claim a spot and face the inevitable confrontation with the established order, or retreat to the edges of the marketplace and hope that obscurity might somehow translate into survival. Either way, you're about to learn that medieval commerce was a full-contact sport, and you've just entered the arena wearing nothing but your modern assumptions and a prayer that things will somehow work out fine. The morning is still young, and already you can sense that this is going to be a very long day. The established vendors have finished their setup routines and are now openly staring at you with expressions ranging from amusement to hostility. Martha the fishwife has been joined by several of her colleagues, and they're having what appears to be a very animated discussion about your presence while occasionally pointing in your direction and making gestures that probably aren't blessings for your health and prosperity. You realize with growing dread that your medieval market adventure is about to begin in earnest, and you haven't even figured out where you're supposed to stand, let alone how you're going to navigate the countless other challenges that await you in this strange and hostile commercial landscape. You decide to approach the situation with confidence, reaching into your pouch to pull out what you assume will be perfectly acceptable payment for a prime market spot. This is where your second catastrophic mistake reveals itself in all its glory. You're holding a handful of coins that might as well be monopoly money for all the good they're going to do you in this medieval economic nightmare. See, medieval currency wasn't like popping into a 7-Eleven and knowing that your $20 bill will buy you exactly $20 worth of overpriced snacks. Oh no, that would be far too simple and convenient for a time period that seemed determined to make every aspect of daily life as complicated and dangerous as possible. Instead, you're dealing with a monetary system that makes cryptocurrency look straightforward and user-friendly. First, let's talk about the sheer variety of coins floating around this market. You've got pennies, but not the pennies you know. These are thick silver discs that actually contain silver and represent serious money. Then there are half pennies, farthings, groats, nobles, florins, ducats, and dozens of other denominations that vary not just in value but in purity, weight, and legitimacy. Some coins are local, minted by the nearest lord who may or may not have had the legal authority to mint them. Others are foreign, brought by traveling merchants from kingdoms you can't even pronounce. The real kicker? Many of these coins have been clipped, shaved, or otherwise tampered with by previous owners looking to scrape off precious metal while still passing the coin at full value. Medieval people were essentially dealing with a currency system where every transaction required the expertise of a precious metals analyst, and getting it wrong could mean the difference between a successful day of trading and ending up in the stocks for attempting to pass counterfeit money. Martha the fishwife takes one look at your handful of coins and lets out a laugh that sounds like a seal being strangled. She says something in Middle English that you don't understand, but the tone strongly suggests it wasn't a compliment about your business acumen. The other vendors are starting to gather around now, attracted by the entertainment value of watching a clueless outsider navigate their monetary minefield. Medieval England alone had over 40 different types of coins in circulation at any given time, and that's not counting foreign currency, which was common in markets near trading routes. A single transaction might involve coins from France, Flanders, Germany, and Italy, each with different silver content, different weights, and different levels of acceptance depending on current political relationships and trade agreements that changed with the seasons. You try to hand over what looks like a reasonable amount of silver, but apparently, you've just offered to pay for a market stall rental with the medieval equivalent of Canadian pennies. The coins you're holding are from the wrong region, the wrong time period, or possibly the wrong planet, because nobody seems willing to accept them at anything approaching face value. One helpful vendor informs you that your coins are from a mint that was shut down 3 years ago for producing underweight silver, making them essentially worthless except as fishing sinkers. But wait, it gets worse. Even if you had the right coins, you'd still need to deal with the medieval measurement system, which was designed by people who apparently thought consistency was for weaklings. Forget about standardized weights and measures. Every region, every market, sometimes every individual vendor had their own system for determining how much of something constituted a sale. The baker measures his bread by the loaf, but his loaves vary in size depending on the price of grain, the phase of the moon, and his general mood that morning. Medieval bread regulations were actually quite strict in many townsbakers who shortchanged customers could be fined, put in the pillory, or even banned from baking. But the regulations themselves were so complex and varied so much from place to place that understanding them required a legal education that most people didn't possess. The cloth merchant measures his fabric by the ell, but an ell in this town is different from an ell in the next town over, and both are different from what you might reasonably expect an ell to be. An English ell was 45 inches, a Flemish ell was 27 inches, and a Scottish ell was 37 inches. But none of this matters because you're not sure which ell this particular merchant is using, and asking for clarification only reveals your ignorance to everyone within earshot. The spice merchant measures his precious goods by weights that seem to have been calibrated by throwing random stones at a scale until it looked about right. Medieval scales were notoriously inaccurate, and many merchants carried multiple sets of weights, one for buying and one for selling, that somehow never quite balanced out in the customer's favor. The official weights were supposed to be checked regularly by market inspectors, but those inspectors could be bribed, intimidated, or simply avoided if you knew the right people and greased the right palms. Historians still argue whether medieval measurement systems were deliberately confusing to facilitate cheating, or whether they simply evolved organically from centuries of local customs. But the practical effect for you is the same. You have no idea what you're buying or how much you should pay for it. The vendors, meanwhile, are perfectly capable of switching between measurement systems mid-transaction to ensure they get the better end of every deal. Let's say you want to buy some cloth. The merchant tells you it costs 3 groats per ell, which sounds reasonable until you realize you don't know how much an ell is. You're not sure you have any groats, and you suspect the merchant is using a different definition of ell than he used for the previous customer. When you ask for clarification, he responds by rattling off a complex formula involving the length of his forearm, the width of his thumb, and some historical precedent dating back to his grandfather's time. Medieval measurements were often based on body parts. A foot was literally the length of someone's foot. A yard was the distance from the tip of the king's nose to the end of his outstretched arm, and a cubit was the length of a forearm. The problem was that not everyone had the same size body parts, and kings occasionally died and were replaced by kings with different arm lengths, causing measurement standards to fluctuate unpredictably. You nod and smile like you understand, but inside you're calculating how quickly you can extract yourself from this situation without triggering a medieval equivalent of a consumer protection lawsuit. The answer, unfortunately, is that there is no graceful exit from a medieval business transaction once you've indicated interest. These people have all day. They've been perfecting their sales techniques for decades, and they can smell confusion like sharks smell blood in the water. The food vendors present their own special category of measurement chaos. Bread is sold by the loaf, but loaf sizes are regulated by local authorities based on grain prices, which fluctuate daily based on weather, politics, and rumors about the latest plague outbreak in neighboring towns. The assize of bread was a medieval law that attempted to standardize bread weights and prices, but it was so complex that even the bakers didn't fully understand it. The law specified different weights for white bread, brown bread, and horse bread, which was exactly what it sounds like, and these weights changed based on the current price of wheat, which was recalculated weekly by officials who may or may not have been sober during the calculation process. The baker is required by law to maintain certain standards, but those standards are enforced by officials who can be bribed with a well-timed meat pie and a promise to look the other way during the next inspection. Medieval market inspectors were supposed to check weights, measures, and quality, but they were often local residents who had to live and work alongside the people they were regulating. This created a system where enforcement was more about maintaining social harmony than ensuring accurate measurements. Beer and ale are measured by the gallon, but medieval gallons bore no resemblance to modern gallons. And besides, most transactions involved smaller quantities measured by vessels with names like pottle, quart, and pint that had completely different meanings than they do today. A medieval pint of ale might contain anywhere from 12 to 20 modern ounces, depending on who was doing the pouring and whether they liked the look of you. The alewife, because brewing was typically women's work in medieval times, uses a series of wooden vessels to measure her products, and each vessel has been crafted by hand to hold what she considers to be the appropriate amount of liquid. These vessels have names like jack, gill, noggin, and firkin that make about as much sense to you as ancient Sanskrit. When you ask for a pint of ale, she hands you a wooden cup filled with something that might be a pint by her grandmother's definition but looks suspiciously small to your modern eyes. Meanwhile, the money changers, because of course there are money changers, adding another layer of complexity to your already impossible situation, are circling like vultures, offering to convert your worthless foreign coins into local currency at exchange rates that would make a payday loan shark blush. They've set up shop near the market entrance, and their scales and counting tables are covered with coins from dozens of different kingdoms, each requiring different conversion calculations that somehow always seem to work out in the money changer's favor. Money changing was actually a sophisticated business in medieval times. The best money changers had to be mathematicians, metallurgists, and economists all rolled into one. They needed to know the silver content of hundreds of different coins, understand fluctuating exchange rates between kingdoms, and keep track of which currencies were currently acceptable and which had been debased or devalued by their issuing authorities. One particularly enterprising money changer offers to convert your silver into local copper coins, explaining that copper is much more practical for small purchases. What he doesn't mention is that the exchange rate he's quoting would leave you with enough purchasing power to buy maybe half a turnip and a stern lecture about fiscal responsibility from the turnip vendor. Medieval copper coins were often worth so little that people carried them in sacks rather than purses, and many transactions required counting out dozens or even hundreds of tiny copper pieces. You're starting to realize that medieval commerce wasn't just about buying and selling goods, it was about navigating a complex web of regional customs, local regulations, and personal relationships that could take years to fully understand. Every transaction required negotiation. Every price was subject to interpretation, and every coin needed to be examined, weighed, and verified by people who had been doing this since before you learned to walk. The complexity extended beyond just coins and measurements. Medieval markets operated on a credit system that made modern banking look primitive. Debts could be inherited, transferred, and used as currency themselves. A baker might accept payment in the form of a promise to deliver grain next month, which could then be traded to the brewer for ale, who might use it to pay the carpenter for barrel repairs. These chains of obligation could stretch across months or even years, and everyone involved had to keep mental track of who owed what to whom. The vendors are getting impatient now. Time is money, even in medieval markets, and you're taking up valuable space and attention that could be directed toward customers who actually know what they're doing. Martha the fishwife is tapping her gutting knife against her wooden counter in a rhythm that suggests she's considering using it for purposes other than fish preparation. The growing crowd of onlookers is starting to mutter among themselves, and you catch snippets of conversation that sound distinctly unfriendly. You make one last desperate attempt to complete a simple transaction, pulling out what you hope is a universally acceptable silver coin and pointing at a loaf of bread. The baker examines your coin with a magnifying glass that he produces from somewhere in his flour-covered apron, weighs it on a tiny scale, bites it to test the metal purity, and finally shakes his head with the disappointed expression of a teacher whose student has just failed a very basic test. The process of coin verification was serious business in medieval times. Counterfeiting was punishable by death, and even legitimate coins could be problematic if they had been clipped, filed, or otherwise tampered with. Merchants developed elaborate testing procedures involving scales, touchstones, and chemical tests that could determine the purity of precious metals with surprising accuracy. A skilled money changer could tell you not just the silver content of a coin, but probably which mine the silver came from and how long ago it was refined. Your coin, he explains in words you mostly don't understand but definitely don't like the sound of, appears to be legitimate silver but was minted in a kingdom currently at war with the local lord, making it politically inadvisable for him to accept. Also, it's been clipped around the edges, reducing its silver content below the minimum acceptable threshold. And besides, he doesn't make change for anything larger than a half-groat, which your coin definitely isn't. The political implications of currency were serious in medieval times. Accepting coins from enemy kingdoms could be seen as treason, while refusing coins from allied kingdoms could be interpreted as an insult. Merchants had to keep track of constantly shifting political relationships and adjust their currency policies accordingly. A coin that was perfectly acceptable on Tuesday might become treasonous by Thursday if diplomatic relationships changed. As you stand there holding your rejected currency and staring at the bread you can't afford to buy with money you apparently don't have, you begin to understand that medieval markets weren't just challenging, they were specifically designed to separate inexperienced customers from their wealth as efficiently as possible. Every vendor was essentially running a small-scale financial consulting business, and their primary recommendation was always that you should give them all your money in exchange for goods valued at approximately half that amount. The morning sun is climbing higher, more customers are arriving, and you're still standing there empty-handed, confused, and increasingly aware that your medieval market adventure has barely begun and is already going spectacularly wrong. The established merchants are starting to lose interest in your entertainment value and are turning their attention to customers who actually have money they can spend, leaving you to contemplate your next move in this increasingly hostile economic environment. With your currency crisis temporarily shelved and your dignity in tatters, you decide that maybe the best approach is to find someone in authority who can help you navigate this commercial maze. After all, every market must have some kind of organizing body, some official who oversees commerce and ensures fair dealing, right? This is where you discover that medieval guild politics make modern corporate bureaucracy look like a friendly neighborhood potluck. You approach what appears to be an official-looking individual wearing slightly better clothes than everyone else and carrying what might be a staff of office or possibly just a really fancy walking stick. This, you soon learn, is the market reeve, and he's about as helpful as a chocolate teapot when it comes to your particular problems. His job is to collect taxes, settle disputes, and maintain order, which doesn't include helping confused strangers figure out basic commerce. When you explain that you'd like to sell some goods in the market, his response is immediate and crushing. Where's your license? What guild do you belong to? Who vouched for your character? Do you have written permission from the local lord? Have you paid the appropriate fees? Are your goods of acceptable quality as determined by the proper authorities? The questions come at you like arrows from a siege engine, and you don't have answers to any of them. See, medieval commerce wasn't a free-for-all where anyone could show up and start selling things. That would be chaos, And medieval society already had plenty of chaos without adding unregulated commerce to the mix. Instead, trade was controlled by a complex system of guilds, licenses, and regulations that made opening a lemonade stand look like launching a space program. The guilds were essentially medieval trade unions crossed with professional licensing boards, sprinkled with a healthy dose of religious fraternity and social club. Every type of craft or trade had its own guild: bakers, brewers, carpenters, blacksmiths, cloth merchants, spice dealers, and dozens of others. These weren't voluntary organizations you could join by paying a membership fee. Oh no, that would be far too simple. Guild membership was typically inherited, passed down from father to son like a family heirloom. Except this heirloom came with 7 years of unpaid apprenticeship, strict quality standards, and the constant surveillance of your fellow guild members who were just waiting for you to screw up so they could fine you, censure you, or kick you out entirely. The guilds controlled who could practice each trade, where they could practice it, what they could charge, and even what quality standards they had to maintain. Let's say you want to sell bread. Sounds simple enough: flour, water, yeast, heat, done. But in medieval terms, you're now attempting to infringe on the sacred territory of the Bakers' Guild, an organization that has spent centuries perfecting the art of making bread and is not about to let some random outsider waltz in and start competing with their members. The Bakers' Guild has rules about everything: what type of flour you can use, how much your loaves must weigh, what you can charge, where you can bake, when you can sell, and how you're allowed to display your wares. They have inspectors who check your ovens, examine your ingredients, and ensure that you're not cutting corners or adulterating your products with unauthorized additives like sawdust or chalk, which apparently was enough of a problem that they needed specific rules against it. But wait, it gets worse. Even if you somehow managed to join the Bakers' Guild, you still couldn't just set up shop anywhere you pleased. You'd need permission from the local authorities, who controlled market spaces like medieval real estate moguls. These permissions came with fees, regulations, and obligations that could include everything from maintaining your section of the market square to providing armed men for the town's defense in times of crisis. The spice trade was even more tightly controlled. The Spice Merchants Guild didn't just regulate who could sell spices, they controlled the entire supply chain from importation to retail sale. Spices were so valuable and the potential for fraud so high that guild members had to prove not just their competence but their moral character. They needed references from other guild members, testimonials from satisfied customers, and often had to post bonds guaranteeing their honest dealing. Historians still argue whether the guild system was primarily about maintaining quality standards or simply about eliminating competition. But from your perspective, the motivation doesn't matter. What matters is that you're trying to participate in an economic system that has spent centuries building walls to keep people exactly like you out. The market reeve is explaining this to you with the patient tone of someone who has had this conversation before, probably with other confused outsiders who thought they could just show up and start selling things. He's not being deliberately unhelpful, actually trying to educate you about the realities of medieval commerce, which is that it's not for amateurs, tourists, or people who don't understand the rules. Even if you had guild membership, you'd still need to navigate the complex web of local regulations that govern market behavior. Some goods could only be sold on certain days of the week. Others required special licenses or inspections. Many trades had regulations about who could buy their products. Butchers, for example, weren't allowed to sell meat to just anyone. They had to prioritize local residents over travelers, Christians over non-Christians, and guild members over non-guild members. The cloth trade had its own special category of complications. Different types of fabric required different licenses, and the quality standards were enforced by inspectors who could literally cut pieces out of your merchandise for testing. If your cloth didn't meet guild standards, could be confiscated, burned, or marked with symbols that identified it as substandard, effectively making it worthless. You ask about obtaining the necessary permits and licenses, thinking perhaps you can work within the system. The market Reeves expression suggests you've just asked him to explain advanced calculus using interpretive dance. The process, he explains, typically takes months or years, requires multiple character references from established guild members, involves fees that would bankrupt a small kingdom, and assumes you already possess the skills and knowledge that come from years of training and experience. The apprenticeship system alone would require 7 years of unpaid labor, during which you'd live with a master craftsman who would teach you the trade while using you as basically free labor. After your apprenticeship, you'd become a journeyman, which sounds impressive but actually means you're qualified to work for other people but not to start your own business. Only after several more years as a journeyman could you apply to become a master craftsman, which required creating a masterpiece that demonstrated your skills to the satisfaction of the guild's examining committee. This masterpiece wasn't just a demonstration of technical competency, it was a political and social test as well. The guild members who judged your masterpiece were also your future competitors, so they had strong incentives to find flaws in your work. Many perfectly competent craftsmen spent years trying to produce a masterpiece that the guild would accept, and some never succeeded at all. But let's say you somehow navigated all these obstacles and became a full guild member in good standing. You still couldn't just set up shop wherever you wanted. Medieval towns had strict zoning laws that made modern urban planning look anarchistic. Butchers had to be located downwind from residential areas. Smiths had to be near water sources but away from wooden buildings. Tanners, whose work involved chemicals that could clear a marketplace faster than a fire alarm, were typically banished to the outskirts of town where their aromatic contributions to local atmosphere wouldn't disturb the good citizens. The market spaces themselves were allocated based on a complex hierarchy that took into account guild membership, family history, political connections, and various fees and bribes that had to be paid to the right people at the right times. Prime locations near the church or town hall were reserved for the most established merchants, while newcomers were relegated to the edges of the market where foot traffic was light and competition from other marginal vendors was fierce. Even your customers were regulated. Many guilds had rules about who their members could sell to and under what circumstances. Credit arrangements required approval from guild authorities. Bulk sales had to be reported to prevent hoarding or price manipulation. Foreign customers required special documentation to ensure they weren't spies, smugglers, or agents of enemy kingdoms. The religious aspects of guild membership added another layer of complexity. Guilds weren't just trade organizations, they were religious brotherhoods with patron saints, mandatory masses, and charitable obligations that required both time and money. Members were expected to contribute to guild funds, participate in religious processions, and maintain moral standards that were enforced by their fellow guild members who acted as a combination of business partners, moral police, and social surveillance network. You're beginning to understand that asking to sell goods in a medieval market without proper guild membership is roughly equivalent to asking to perform surgery without a medical license, practice law without passing the bar exam, or fly a commercial airliner without pilot training. It's not just prohibited, it's practically inconceivable to people who have spent their entire lives working within this regulated system. The market reeve is looking at you with a mixture of pity and suspicion that suggests he's trying to decide whether you're incredibly naive or potentially dangerous. Your questions about permits and licenses have marked you as either a foreign agent conducting commercial espionage, a lunatic who doesn't understand basic social structures, or possibly both. Meanwhile, the established vendors are going about their business with the casual efficiency of people who understand exactly how their world works. They greet their guild brothers with familiar nods, discuss technical matters using specialized vocabulary you don't understand, and navigate complex transactions with the confidence that comes from years of training and experience. You realize that you're not just an outsider in this marquiserie, a complete alien attempting to participate in a social and economic system that you don't understand and that has no place for people like you. Every aspect of medieval commerce, from the simplest transaction to the most complex business arrangement, requires knowledge, connections, and credentials that you simply don't possess. The morning is advancing, and your options are rapidly dwindling from limited to non-existent. Having thoroughly established that you're not qualified to sell anything, not authorized to buy much of anything, and generally persona non grata in the commercial sphere, you decide that perhaps you should focus on a more basic need, figuring out why your eyes are watering, your stomach is churning, and every breath feels like you're inhaling the concentrated essence of medieval authenticity. Welcome to the hygiene horror show that is a typical medieval marketplace, where soap is a luxury item and deodorant won't be invented for another few centuries. The first thing that literally hits you like a physical forceus, the smell. It's not just one smell. Mind you, that would be manageable. Instead, it's a complex symphony of odors that assault your nostrils with the subtlety of a medieval siege engine. There's the tang of unwashed human bodies, the sweet rot of decomposing food scraps, the acrid bite of wood smoke mixed with the distinctly unpleasant aroma of burning animal dung, which people actually used as fuel because wood was expensive and dried manure was free. Your modern nose, accustomed to the sanitized world of soap, shampoo, and industrial cleaning products, is completely unprepared for this olfactory assault. Medieval people didn't bathe regularly because they believed it was unhealthy, and to be fair, given the quality of medieval water supplies, they might have had a point. Instead, they changed their linen undergarments occasionally and considered that sufficient for personal hygiene. The merchants around you seem completely oblivious to what you're experiencing. Martha the fishwife, for instance, is standing in a cloud of aroma that combines the smell of her fish with her own personal contribution to the atmosphere. She's been gutting herring since before dawn, and the combination of fish scales, blood, and medieval antiperspirant, which is to say, none whatsoever, creates a scent profile that would make a skunk reconsider its life choices. Medieval people had a completely different relationship with bodily odors than we do. They recognized that people had natural smells, but they didn't consider these smells inherently offensive the way modern people do. Strong body odor was simply part of the human condition, like having brown eyes or being right-handed. What they did find offensive were artificial perfumes and scents, which were associated with vanity, deception, and possibly witchcraft. The cobblestones beneath your feet are slick with a combination of mud, spilled liquids, and organic matter that you really don't want to think about too carefully. Medieval markets didn't have sanitation departments or street cleaning crews. The general approach to waste management was to throw it out into the street and hope that rain, pigs, or scavenging dogs would eventually deal with it. This created a layer of what historians politely call urban sediment that accumulated over time and contributed to the market's distinctive ambience. You notice that everyone else navigates this mess with practiced ease, wearing shoes that are basically leather pouches designed to protect their feet from the worst of the ground conditions while remaining easy to clean or abandon if they became too contaminated. Your modern footwear, designed for sidewalks and shopping mall floors, is already becoming saturated with medieval street essence. The animals add their own special contribution to the aromatic experience. Chickens wander freely through the market, leaving their calling cards wherever they please. Pigs root through the garbage, creating small avalanches of waste that spread the fragrance around with artistic flair. Dogs of uncertain breeding and questionable health status add their own notes to the symphony, while the occasional cat surveys the chaos from a safe perch, looking smug about their superior hygiene standards. But the real revelation comes when you realize that the smell isn't just coming from the market itself, it's coming from the people. Medieval personal hygiene was based on principles that would make a modern health inspector faint. People washed their hands and faces occasionally, usually in cold water without soap, and considered that sufficient for most purposes. Full-body bathing was rare, expensive, and often considered medically dangerous. The medieval theory was that washing removed the body's natural protective oils, leaving you vulnerable to disease and evil humors. Hot water was particularly suspect because it opened the pores, allowing illness to enter the body. This led to a hygiene philosophy that prioritized changing clothes over washing bodies. And even clothes weren't changed that frequently by modern standards. Wealthy people might change their linen shirts once a week, while common people made their clothing last as long as possible between washings. Washing clothes was a major undertaking that involved hauling water, heating it over fires, and using harsh soaps that were hard on both the fabric and the person doing the washing. Most people owned only a few changes of clothing, so washing day was a significant event that couldn't happen too often. The result of all this is that you're surrounded by people wearing clothes that have been absorbing body odors, cooking smoke, and general environmental contamination for weeks or months at a time. The fabric holds these odors like a medieval time capsule, releasing them gradually throughout the day as people move around and the sun heats up their clothing. Historians still argue whether medieval people really couldn't smell these odors or whether they simply adapted to them over time. But the practical effect for you is the same. You're breathing air that would probably require an environmental impact study in the modern world. The food vendors add their own special touches to the aromatic landscape. The baker's stall smells reasonably pleasant, with the warm scent of bread and yeast. But even that's complicated by the fact that medieval ovens were often shared community facilities that were used for baking bread in the morning and roasting meat in the afternoon, creating complex odor combinations that tell the story of the day's culinary activities. The butcher's area is where things get really interesting from a sensory perspective. Medieval butchers worked with whole animals, processing everything on site in full view of customers who wanted to ensure they were getting fresh meat. The smell of raw meat, blood, and various organs mingles with the scent of the herbs and spices used to mask the odors of less than perfectly fresh products. Medieval people had a different concept of food freshness than we do. Without refrigeration, they expected meat to develop what we might call character over time. Slight spoilage wasn't necessarily a deal breaker, it just meant the meat needed more aggressive seasoning or longer cooking times. The line between aged and spoiled was drawn in a very different place than it would be today. The spice merchant stall provides some relief from the prevailing aromatic chaos, offering hints of cinnamon, pepper, and other exotic scents that were literally worth more than gold. But even these pleasant smells are complicated by the fact that spices were often stored in containers that had previously held other substances, and medieval storage methods weren't exactly airtight. You're starting to understand that medieval people lived in a world where strong smells were simply part of the background environment, like traffic noise in a modern city. They developed strategies for dealing with particularly offensive odors, holding herbs or flowers to their noses, breathing through their mouths, or simply accepting that some places and activities came with unavoidable aromatic challenges. The wealthy carried pomanders, decorative containers filled with aromatic substances like dried flowers, spices, or ambergris that they could hold to their noses when the ambient odor situation became too challenging. These weren't just luxury items. They were practical tools for surviving in a world where pleasant smells were rare and offensive ones were common. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of the medieval hygiene experience is the realization that this isn't temporary. You can't escape to an air-conditioned car or a sanitized bathroom. There's no hand sanitizer, no breath mints, no quick shower to wash off the day's accumulation of medieval atmosphere. This is the baseline human condition, and everyone around you has adapted to it so completely that they probably don't even notice it anymore. The psychological impact of constant exposure to these odors is something modern people rarely consider. Smell is directly connected to the emotional centers of the brain, and the constant assault of unpleasant odors would affect your mood, your appetite, your sleep, and your general quality of life in ways that are hard to imagine. Medieval people who could afford it used strong perfumes, burned incense, and planted aromatic gardens specifically to combat the default odor environment. Your modern sensibilities are being challenged in ways you never anticipated. The marketplace isn't just dirty by contemporary standards, it's operating according to completely different assumptions about cleanliness, hygiene, and acceptable living conditions. What seems appalling to you is simply normal life to everyone else, and your obvious discomfort marks you as clearly as if you were wearing a neon sign advertising your foreignness. The vendors are starting to notice your reaction to the aromatic environment, and their expressions suggest they're not sure whether to be offended or amused. From their perspective, you're displaying an almost supernatural sensitivity to perfectly normal market conditions, which adds another layer to your growing reputation as the strangest customer they've encountered in recent memory. You realize that surviving a day in this market isn't just about navigating the commercial and social challenges, it's about adapting to an entire sensory environment that is fundamentally different from anything in your experience. Every breath is a reminder that you're not just visiting a different time period, you're visiting a different definition of what human civilization looks like, smells like, and feels like. The morning sun is getting higher, the market is getting busier, and the aromatic intensity is building like a medieval crescendo that shows no signs of reaching its peak anytime soon. With your nose gradually numbing to the aromatic assault and your eyes finally stopping their involuntary watering, you decide that perhaps it's time to address a more fundamental need: eating something. After all, you've been standing in this marketplace for hours now, breathing deeply of medieval atmosphere and working up quite an appetite. This is where you discover that medieval food safety makes Russian roulette look like a sensible risk management strategy. Your first instinct is to look for something simple and safe, maybe some bread, perhaps a bit of cheese, possibly some ale to wash it down. These seem like reasonable choices until you start paying attention to how medieval food is actually prepared, stored, and sold. Then you realize that every bite you take in this marketplace is essentially a gamble with your digestive system, your immune system, and possibly your life. Let's start with the bread, which should be the safest option available. Medieval bread was the foundation of the diet, the staff of life, the one food that everyone ate every day. Surely bread would be safe, right? Well, not exactly. The baker you're eyeing has been up since before dawn, kneading dough with hands that haven't seen soap in living memory and probably won't see soap until someone invents it properly. Medieval bakers worked with flour that was ground in mills powered by water wheels or windmills, processed through grinding stones that occasionally shed bits of rock into the final product. The flour was stored in conditions that would make a modern health inspector weep open sacks in rooms shared with rodents, insects, and whatever other creatures happened to wander in. By the time the flour reached the baker, it had already been on quite an adventure. The water used in bread making came from wells that were often contaminated with runoff from latrines, animal pens, and various industrial activities. Medieval people didn't understand the connection between water quality and disease, so they used whatever water was available and hoped for the best. The yeast was wild yeast captured from the air or saved from previous batches, carrying with it whatever microorganisms happened to be floating around the medieval atmosphere. But here's where it gets really interesting. Medieval bread was often adulterated with cheaper substances to increase profits. Sawdust, chalk, alum, and other creative additives were commonly mixed into flour to stretch supplies and improve appearance. The assize of bread was supposed to prevent this kind of fraud, but enforcement was spotty and corruption was common. You might be buying bread, or you might be buying a flour-based construction material with some nutritional value as a happy accident. The baker's oven presents its own set of challenges. Medieval ovens were massive stone structures that were heated by burning wood or other combustible materials inside them, then removing the coals and baking in the residual heat. This process left ash, charcoal particles, and various combustion byproducts that could contaminate the bread. The ovens were rarely cleaned thoroughly, so each loaf carried the accumulated flavors and potential contaminants from hundreds of previous baking sessions. You watch as the baker pulls loaves from his oven using a long wooden paddle, then sets them on a wooden counter that looks like it's been in continuous use since the Norman conquest. The bread is still warm, which is appealing, but you notice that the counter hasn't been cleaned, it's just been brushed off to remove the larger debris from previous sales. Medieval people didn't understand germ theory, so the idea of sanitizing surfaces between uses simply didn't exist. Moving on to cheese, which seems like it might be safer since it's fermented and therefore somewhat preserved. Medieval cheese making was actually quite sophisticated, but storage and transport were challenging without refrigeration. The cheese vendor has his wares displayed on wooden boards under the open sky, where they've been accumulating dust, insects, and whatever else happens to land on them since the market opened at dawn. Medieval people had a different relationship with food spoilage than modern consumers. Slight mold on cheese wasn't necessarily a problem, it was just trimmed off and the rest consumed. The line between aged and spoiled was drawn based on practical experience rather than scientific understanding, and that line was considerably more tolerant than modern food safety standards would recommend. The cheese itself was made from milk that came from cows, goats, or sheep that lived in conditions that would horrify modern dairy farmers. The animals drank from streams and ponds that were also used for washing clothes, disposing of waste, and various industrial purposes. The milk was collected in wooden buckets, stored in wooden containers, and processed using wooden tools that were cleaned with cold water and maybe a bit of sand for scrubbing. Historians still argue whether medieval people had stronger immune systems due to constant exposure to pathogens, or whether they simply accepted higher rates of food poisoning as part of normal life. But from your perspective, the academic debate is less important than the practical question of whether you dare risk eating that appealing-looking wheel of cheese. The meat situation is where medieval food safety really gets creative. The butcher has his wares hanging from wooden hooks in the open air, where they've been developing character since yesterday, possibly longer. Medieval people expected meat to hang for a while before consumption. It was considered more tender and flavorful than freshly killed meat. The fact that bacteria were also tenderizing the meat was an unrecognized bonus feature. Medieval butchers were required by guild regulations to sell their meat within a certain time frame, but those time frames were measured in days rather than hours, and enforcement was variable depending on local politics and the butcher's relationship with market officials. Meat that was starting to turn was often heavily salted, spiced, or cooked into stews where the off flavors could be masked by aggressive seasoning. The butcher is carving portions from a side of beef that's been hanging in his stall since the market opened, using a knife that he occasionally wipes on his apron, the same apron he's been wearing all morning while handling raw meat, counting money, and dealing with various market transactions. Cross-contamination wasn't a concept that existed in medieval thinking, so the same surfaces and tools were used for different purposes without concern. You notice that the meat is attracting flies, which the butcher casually brushes away without seeming particularly concerned. Medieval people understood that flies were annoying, but they didn't make the connection between flies and disease transmission. The flies were just part of the natural environment, like birds or clouds, and their presence on food was accepted as unavoidable. The ale situation presents a different set of challenges. Medieval ale was actually safer than water in many cases because the brewing process involved boiling, which killed some pathogens, and the alcohol content provided some antimicrobial protection. But medieval ale was also very different from modern beer. It was lower in alcohol, higher in carbohydrates, and often flavored with herbs and spices that covered a multitude of brewing sins. The alewife serves her product from wooden barrels that have been in continuous use for months or years. These barrels are never fully clean, just rinsed out between batches and refilled. Over time, they develop a complex ecosystem of yeasts, bacteria, and other microorganisms that contribute to the ale's flavor profile in ways that modern brewers would find terrifying. The ale is served in wooden cups that are shared among customers, with perhaps a quick rinse in a bucket of water between users. The concept of individual drinking vessels was considered wasteful and unnecessarily fastidious. Medieval people regularly shared eating and drinking vessels without concern, which helped spread diseases but also built community bonds in ways that modern hygiene practices have eliminated. As you contemplate your dining options, you begin to understand that medieval eating wasn't just about nutrition, it was about risk management. Every meal required decisions about which risks were acceptable and which foods were worth gambling on. People developed strategies for minimizing danger, eating bread while it was fresh, choosing vendors with good reputations, avoiding certain foods during hot weather, and consuming alcohol with meals to help kill potential pathogens. The wealthy had access to spices that provided both flavor and antimicrobial properties. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and other expensive seasonings weren't just luxury items, they were practical tools for making questionable food safer to eat. The poor had to rely on local herbs, salt, and cooking techniques to reduce their risk of food poisoning. Medieval people also practiced a form of intuitive food safety based on appearance, smell, and texture. They could tell when meat was too far gone, when milk had soured beyond recovery, and when bread had developed dangerous molds. This knowledge was passed down through generations and represented centuries of accumulated experience with food preservation and safety. But here's the real challenge for your modern sensibilities. Medieval people accepted food poisoning as a normal part of life. Stomach upset, digestive problems, and occasional bouts of serious illness were expected consequences of eating, especially during certain seasons or when food supplies were limited. They had herbal remedies for digestive problems and simply endured the discomfort as part of the human condition. Your modern immune system, accustomed to sanitized food and sterile preparation methods, is completely unprepared for the bacterial diversity of a medieval meal. What wouldn't faze a medieval person could put you in bed for days or worse. The beneficial gut bacteria that helped medieval people digest their challenging diet are completely absent from your modern microbiome. As you stand there surveying your dining options, you realize that choosing what to eat in a medieval market isn't just about preference or appetite, it's about survival strategy. Every vendor represents a different category of risk. Every food item requires careful evaluation, and every meal is essentially a small adventure in biological warfare. The morning is advancing toward noon. Your stomach is rumbling with increasing insistence, and you're faced with the fundamental challenge of finding something to eat that won't kill you, incapacitate you, or leave you wishing you'd never heard of medieval cuisine. Having decided that perhaps you should attempt to communicate with someone about your increasingly desperate situation, you approach what seems like a friendly-looking baker and open your mouth to speak. This is where you discover that the English you learned in school bears about as much resemblance to medieval English as a smartphone bears to a stone axe. Welcome to the wonderful world of Middle English, where every conversation sounds like someone gargling gravel while reciting poetry, and even simple requests become exercises in archaeological linguistics. You start with what you think is a reasonable approach. "Excuse me, could you tell me how much this bread costs?" The baker looks at you with the expression of someone who has just heard a foreign language mixed with baby talk and possibly some kind of mystical incantation. He responds with something that sounds like, "Tichari pans for a loof, but jif ye be a stronger, it moot be 4 pans, and jif ye han nat coin of this riem, ye moot change it fyrst with the coin chongir by the church." You nod and smile, pretending you understood something other than the general tone of commercial negotiation, while internally trying to decode what just happened to the English language. Middle English wasn't just modern English with funny spelling, it was a genuinely different language with different grammar, different vocabulary, and pronunciation patterns that make it sound like everyone learned English from a drunk Scotsman with a mouth full of marbles. The problem isn't just vocabulary, though that's challenging enough. Medieval people used words that have completely disappeared from modern English, referred to concepts that no longer exist, and pronounced familiar words in ways that would make them unrecognizable. Night was pronounced K-night with the K, and J sounds fully articulated. Name sounded more like Name. Simple words like house came out as whose, and mouse was moose, making basic communication sound like a veterinary emergency. But it gets worse. Regional dialects were so distinct that people from different parts of England often had trouble understanding each other. And you're dealing with not just temporal linguistic drift, but potentially regional variations that could make Yorkshire English as foreign to London English as Italian is to Portuguese. The baker might be speaking perfectly clear medieval English by the standards of his region and time period, but to your ears, it sounds like he's making it up as he goes along. Grammar was also different in ways that would trip up even someone who managed to learn medieval vocabulary. Word order was more flexible, verb conjugations were more complex, and the whole structure of sentences followed patterns that modern English has abandoned. I am going to the market might come out as to market go I shall, or going to market am I, or any number of other combinations that sound like Yoda learned English from a Renaissance fair. You try gesturing, pointing at the bread and holding up coins, hoping that universal human commerce language will bridge the gap. The baker nods understandingly and launches into what seems like a lengthy explanation that includes hand gestures, references to various coins, mentions of weights and measures, and possibly a brief autobiography. You catch maybe one word in 10, and those are mostly prepositions that don't help you understand what he's actually trying to communicate. Medieval people were accustomed to dealing with language barriers. Markets attracted travelers from distant regions, foreign merchants, and people speaking varieties of English that were practically different languages. They developed strategies for communication that relied heavily on gesturing, demonstration, and shared understanding of commercial practices. But these strategies assumed that everyone involved understood the basic framework of medieval commerce, which you decidedly do not. The baker tries a different approach, speaking more slowly and using simpler words. But simpler Middle English is still incomprehensible to your modern ears. He's probably saying something like, "This bread costs 3 pence, but you're obviously a foreigner, so I'll charge you 4 pence. And if you don't have local currency, you'll need to visit the money changer near the church." But what you're hearing sounds more like ancient Celtic poetry with occasional English words scattered throughout like linguistic breadcrumbs. Other customers are starting to notice your communication difficulties, and they're responding with a mixture of amusement, suspicion, and helpfulness that makes your situation simultaneously better and worse. One helpful soul tries to translate, but his explanation involves even more complex Middle English delivered at higher volume. Apparently on the theory that louder medieval language is more comprehensible than quieter medieval language. Medieval people didn't have the concept of speaking slowly and clearly for foreigners, because most foreigners they encountered were from other regions where related languages were spoken, not from centuries in the future where the language had evolved beyond recognition. Their accommodation strategies involved using more basic vocabulary and simpler grammar, but their definition of basic still assumed familiarity with medieval life, medieval commerce, and medieval social structures. You're beginning to realize that the language barrier isn't just about words and pronunciation, it's about entire conceptual frameworks that have changed over the centuries. When the baker talks about a groat's worth of bread, he's not just naming a price. He's referencing a complex system of currency, weights, measures, and commercial practices that you don't understand. Even if you could translate the individual words, you'd still be missing the cultural context that gives them meaning. Historians still argue whether medieval people were more linguistically flexible than modern people due to their exposure to regional dialects and foreign languages, or whether they simply had more patience for communication difficulties because alternative options didn't exist. Either way, They were definitely more accustomed to working through language barriers than most modern people, who expect clear communication and become frustrated when it's not immediately available. The cloth merchant tries to help by drawing pictures in the dirt with a stick, illustrating concepts like quantity, price, and quality through simple diagrams. This works better than verbal communication, but it also attracts a small crowd of onlookers who are fascinated by this strange new form of commercial negotiation. Medieval markets were community social events, and unusual occurrences quickly became public entertainment. Your attempts to communicate are revealing cultural assumptions that you didn't even know you had. When you point at something and expect the vendor to understand that you want to buy it, you're assuming a commercial culture where individual desires drive transactions. Medieval commerce was more community-oriented, with considerations of social status, family relationships, and mutual obligations playing important roles in every exchange. The language difficulties are compounded by the fact that medieval people used different metaphors, references, and conceptual frameworks than modern people. When someone talks about time, they might reference church bells, seasonal agricultural activities, or religious observances rather than hours and minutes. When they discuss distance, they might use measurements based on how far a person can walk in a day or how long it takes to cook a meal. Even basic concepts like numbers were expressed differently. Medieval people were more likely to use concrete references than abstract mathematics. Instead of saying 12, they might say a dozen, and instead of saying 100, they might say a long hundred, which could mean 120 or some other quantity depending on what was being counted and local custom. Religious references permeated medieval language in ways that would be unfamiliar to modern secular speakers. People swore by saints, referenced religious holidays when discussing time, and used theological concepts as casual metaphors. Understanding medieval conversation required not just linguistic knowledge but familiarity with medieval Christianity, which was as much a cultural framework as a religious system. Your modern tendency to speak directly and explicitly is also causing communication problems. Medieval people often communicated indirectly, using hints, suggestions, and implications rather than direct statements. This was partly due to social hierarchies. It wasn't always safe or appropriate to speak directly, and partly due to cultural preferences for subtle communication that demonstrated wit and sophistication. The growing crowd around your linguistic struggles includes people who are genuinely trying to help, others who are simply curious about the entertainment value, and a few who are clearly wondering whether you might be mentally deficient, criminally suspicious, or possibly possessed by demons. Medieval people had limited frameworks for understanding someone who appeared normal but couldn't communicate effectively. As the morning progresses and your communication attempts become increasingly desperate, you begin to understand that language isn't just about words, it's about shared cultural knowledge, common frames of reference, and mutual understanding of basic life concepts. Even if you could master Middle English vocabulary and grammar, you'd still be missing the cultural fluency that makes real communication possible. The baker is showing admirable patience with your linguistic challenges, but you can see that his other customers are becoming impatient with the delay. Medieval markets operated on efficient turnover, and your communication difficulties are disrupting the normal flow of commercial activity. The longer you take to complete a simple transaction, the more attention you attract, and attention in a medieval market is rarely beneficial for obvious outsiders. You realize that your language difficulties aren't just inconvenient theory, potentially dangerous. In a world where clear communication could mean the difference between successful commerce and accusations of fraud, theft, or witchcraft, your inability to express yourself clearly marks you as a potential threat to social order. The morning sun is climbing higher, the market is getting busier, and your attempts to communicate are becoming increasingly frantic as you realize that language barriers in medieval times weren't just frustrating, they could be fatal for people who couldn't make themselves understood in crucial situations. Just when you think your day couldn't possibly get any worse, you notice a group of individuals who seem to be paying unusually close attention to your struggles with medieval commerce. They're not vendors, they're not customers, and they're definitely not there to help. These are the marketplace predators, pickpockets, con artists, and general criminals who have identified you as the perfect mark. Congratulations, you've just attracted the attention of medieval organized crime, and they're about to give you a masterclass in why tourists in any time period are considered easy prey. Medieval markets were prime hunting grounds for criminals because they combined large crowds, distracted people carrying money, and enough chaos to provide cover for illegal activities. The criminals who worked these markets weren't desperate amateurs, they were professionals who had turned theft and fraud into sophisticated enterprises that would impress modern organized crime syndicates. The pickpockets are the artists of the medieval criminal world. They've been watching you struggle with currency, language, and basic market navigation, and they've correctly identified you as someone who wouldn't notice a few coins going missing from your purse. Medieval pickpockets worked in teams, with one person creating a distraction while another performed the actual theft, and a third who served as a lookout and escape route coordinator. You feel a gentle bump from behind as someone seemingly stumbles into you while navigating the crowded marketplace. The person apologizes profusely in Middle English, brushing off your clothes and expressing concern about whether you've been injured. It's a performance worthy of a medieval theater troupe, complete with dramatic gestures and elaborate expressions of remorse. What you don't realize is that during this touching display of human compassion, his partner has just relieved you of half your coin purse through techniques perfected over years of professional practice. Medieval pickpockets were incredibly skilled because their lives depended on it. Getting caught meant losing a hand, being branded, or worse, so they developed techniques that would make modern magicians envious. They could remove coins from purses, jewelry from bodies, and small valuable items from pockets without their victims feeling anything. They studied their marks carefully, understanding exactly where people kept their valuables and how to access them without detection. The con artists present a different category of challenge. While pickpockets work quickly and disappear, con artists engage their marks in elaborate schemes that can last for hours or even days. They've noticed that you're confused about currency, weights, measures, and basic market practices, making you perfect for scams that rely on the victim's ignorance of local customs. One particularly charming individual approaches you with what appears to be genuine helpfulness. He notices your communication difficulties and offers to serve as your translator and guide to the market. He speaks what sounds like reasonable English, certainly more comprehensible than the Middle English everyone else has been using, and he seems knowledgeable about market practices and pricing. This should be your first warning sign, but you're so relieved to find someone who can help that you miss the obvious red flags. Medieval con artists often posed as helpful intermediaries, offering services that seemed legitimate while actually setting up elaborate frauds. Your new friend explains the currency system, helps you understand measurements, and guides you through negotiations with vendors. What he's actually doing is steering you toward accomplices who are selling overpriced goods, negotiating deals that benefit him rather than you, and generally ensuring that every transaction leaves you poorer and him richer. The beauty of medieval con games was that they relied on the victim's gratitude and trust. Your helpful guide isn't obviously stealing from Yohas, providing services that seem valuable while subtly manipulating every interaction to his advantage. By the time you realize what's happening, you've participated willingly in your own financial destruction. Historians still argue whether medieval criminals were more or less sophisticated than modern ones, but what's clear is that they operated in an environment where law enforcement was limited, punishment was severe but inconsistent, and victims had little recourse once they'd been robbed. This created strong incentives for criminals to be very good at what they did while remaining invisible to authorities. The cut purses represent the most direct threat to your physical safety. Medieval purses weren't kept in pockets, they were attached to belts or clothing with strings or leather cords that could be cut quickly by someone with a sharp knife and steady hands. Cut purses worked in crowded areas where physical contact was common and expected, using the press of bodies to conceal their activities. You notice someone standing unusually close behind you while you're trying to negotiate with a vendor. Medieval people had different concepts of personal space than modern people, so close physical proximity wasn't automatically suspicious. But this particular individual seems to be maintaining contact even when the crowd shifts. What you don't realize is that he's using a small, very sharp knife to carefully cut the cords holding your purse while using his body to prevent you from feeling the loss of weight. Medieval cut purses were so skilled that they could remove a purse without the victim noticing until they reached for their money, sometimes hours later. They understood exactly how much pressure to apply, which angle to cut from, and how to catch the falling purse without making noise or creating movement that would alert their victim. The receivers and fences operate the back end of the medieval criminal economy, providing markets for stolen goods and converting hot merchandise into usable currency. They run apparently legitimate businesses, taverns, shops, or trading operations that serve as fronts for criminal enterprises. These individuals have relationships with legitimate merchants, corrupt officials, and criminal networks that span multiple towns and regions. Your stolen coins don't just disappear into the medieval equivalent of a criminal's pocket. They enter a sophisticated network that can launder money, transport goods across regions, and convert stolen merchandise into different forms of wealth that are harder to trace. Medieval criminals operated what amounted to an underground economy that paralleled legitimate commerce. The protection racket operators present a different kind of threat. They don't steal from you directly. Instead, they offer to protect you from other criminals for a modest fee. Of course, if you decline their generous offer, you might find yourself experiencing exactly the kinds of problems they promised to prevent. Medieval markets attracted violent individuals who used the threat of physical harm to extract tribute from vulnerable merchants and customers. These weren't random thugs looking for quick scores. They were organized criminals who understood that regular income from protection payments was more profitable than occasional theft. They maintained territories, honored agreements with paying customers, and actually did provide some protection from other criminals while simultaneously creating the very danger they claimed to guard against. Your obvious foreignness and confusion about local customs makes you an ideal target for protection scams. You don't know which areas are dangerous, which people to avoid, or what constitutes normal market behavior versus criminal activity. The protection sellers can easily convince you that the marketplace is full of threats while positioning themselves as your only reliable defense. The marketplace officials add another layer of complexity to the criminal landscape. Some are legitimate authorities trying to maintain order, but others are corrupt individuals who have arrangements with criminal networks. They might tip off thieves about wealthy marks, ignore certain types of criminal activity in exchange for bribes, or even participate directly in fraudulent schemes. Medieval law enforcement was a mixture of official authority, community self-policing, and private security arrangements that created opportunities for corruption and abuse. The line between legitimate market officials and criminal accomplices wasn't always clear, and naive visitors could easily find themselves dealing with people who wore official-looking badges while running unofficial criminal enterprises. You're beginning to realize that the medieval marketplace isn't just chaotic and confusing, it's actively dangerous for people who don't understand the rules, the players, and the various criminal enterprises that operate within apparently legitimate commercial activities. Every interaction could be a setup, every helpful stranger might be running a scam, and every transaction could leave you poorer and more vulnerable than before. The criminals have been watching you all morning, cataloging your weaknesses, understanding your resources, and planning their approaches. They know you're confused, they know you're carrying money, and they know you don't understand enough about medieval market culture to recognize their activities as criminal rather than helpful. As the morning progresses and the market gets busier, the criminal element is preparing to make their moves. The pickpockets are positioning themselves for optimal access. The con artists are finalizing their approaches, and the protection sellers are getting ready to explain why you desperately need their services. You're about to discover that medieval markets weren't just places of commerce. They were battlegrounds where criminals and honest people engaged in a constant struggle for economic survival. And you've just painted a target on yourself that every predator in the marketplace can see clearly. The midday sun is approaching its peak. The criminal element is closing in, and your medieval market adventure is about to take a distinctly darker turn. Just as you're beginning to think you might actually survive the criminal attention currently focused on you, a new figure appears on the scene who makes everyone else seem positively friendly by comparison. This individual wears robes that mark him as a member of the clergy, carries himself with the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience, and is looking at you with the kind of intense scrutiny typically reserved for suspected heretics. Meet Brother Augustine, and you're about to discover that medieval religious authority makes modern bureaucracy look like a casual suggestion box. The medieval church wasn't just a religious institution, it was a parallel government with its own laws, courts, enforcement mechanisms, and very definite opinions about proper behavior, moral conduct, and acceptable commercial practices. Every aspect of medieval life fell under church scrutiny, and markets were no exception. Church officials monitored commerce to ensure that trading practices aligned with religious teachings about fair pricing, honest dealing, and moral conduct. Brother Augustine has been watching your activities all morning, and several aspects of your behavior have caught his attention in ways that are not beneficial to your continued well-being. First, there's the matter of your obvious foreignness combined with your inability to communicate effectively. Medieval people were suspicious of strangers, and the church was particularly concerned about foreign influences that might spread heretical ideas, corrupt local customs, or undermine religious authority. Your strange behavior, confused expressions, and apparent ignorance of basic social norms have led Brother Augustine to wonder whether you might be suffering from some form of spiritual affliction. Medieval people understood mental illness, unusual behavior, and social dysfunction through religious frameworks that often involved demonic possession, divine punishment, or corruption by evil influences. The idea that someone could simply be from a different time period was, obviously, not among their diagnostic possibilities. But the real problem is your commerce attempts. The church had very specific rules about buying and selling that were designed to prevent exploitation, ensure fair dealing, and maintain social harmony. These rules covered everything from acceptable profit margins to appropriate business hours, and violations could result in anything from public penance to excommunication, depending on the severity of the offense and the mood of local religious authorities. Medieval economic theory was heavily influenced by religious teachings about greed, exploitation, and social justice. The concept of just price meant that merchants couldn't charge whatever the market would bear. They were expected to sell goods at prices that were fair to both buyer and seller. Excessive profits were considered a form of theft, and engaging in economic activities that harmed the community was seen as a sin against both God and neighbor. Your attempts to negotiate prices, particularly your willingness to pay whatever vendors asked without understanding local standards, has marked you as someone who either doesn't understand proper commercial behavior or doesn't care about it. From Brother Augustine's perspective, both possibilities are problematic and require investigation. The church considered ignorance of proper commercial ethics to be as dangerous as deliberate fraud, because both could disrupt the social order that kept medieval communities functioning. The church also regulated when commercial activities could take place. Sundays and religious holidays were supposed to be free from secular pursuits, and even regular market days had restrictions about trading during religious services. Your presence in the market at times when faithful Christians should be engaged in prayer and contemplation suggests either ignorance of religious obligations or deliberate disrespect for sacred traditions. Medieval people were expected to demonstrate their religious devotion through public behavior that everyone could observe and evaluate. Your failure to cross yourself at appropriate moments, your lack of obvious prayers before meals or transactions, and your general unfamiliarity with religious customs that were as automatic as breathing for medieval Christians has attracted the kind of attention you really don't want. The religious calendar dominated medieval life in ways that modern secular people find hard to imagine. Every day had religious significance. Every activity had spiritual implications. And every person was expected to demonstrate their faith through constant, visible acts of devotion. Markets operated within this religious framework, with specific prayers for different types of transactions, religious symbols displayed prominently, and constant reminders that commerce was subject to divine oversight. Brother Augustine approaches you with the measured steps of someone who has dealt with spiritual problems before and knows exactly how to handle them. His expression combines pastoral concern with the steely determination of someone who takes religious law very seriously. When he speaks, his Latin-accented English is clear enough that you can understand most of what he's saying, which unfortunately makes his message more rather than less alarming. He wants to know where you're from, what brings you to this market, why you don't seem familiar with local customs, and most importantly, whether you've been properly instructed in Christian doctrine. These aren't casual conversation starters theory official inquiries that could lead to formal religious proceedings if your answers aren't satisfactory. Medieval religious authority operated through a complex system of canon law that paralleled and sometimes superseded secular law. Church courts had jurisdiction over moral offenses, religious violations, and anything that could be construed as threatening to spiritual well-being. The penalties ranged from minor penances to major excommunication, with the most serious offenses potentially resulting in charges of heresy, which could be a death sentence. Canon law was incredibly comprehensive, covering not just obvious religious matters but also commercial practices, family relationships, sexual behavior, dietary restrictions, clothing choices, and virtually every other aspect of human activity. Medieval people lived their entire lives under the constant supervision of religious authorities who had both the power and the obligation to correct any behavior that deviated from approved norms. Historians still argue whether medieval religious authorities were primarily concerned with genuine spiritual welfare or simply maintaining institutional power. But from your perspective, the motivation doesn't matter. What matters is that Brother Augustine has the authority to make your life extremely difficult, and he's clearly considering whether to exercise that authority. Your language difficulties become even more problematic when dealing with religious authority. Medieval clerics spoke Latin as well as the vernacular, and they expected educated people to have at least basic familiarity with religious Latin. Your obvious unfamiliarity with Latin phrases, prayers, and religious terminology marks you as either uneducated or foreign, both of which require explanation and potentially correction. The questions keep coming, and they're getting more specific. Brother Augustine wants to know which church you attend, who your priest is, when you last made confession, and whether you've been properly catechized in Christian doctrine. These aren't academic inquirious theory tests designed to determine whether you're a faithful Christian or someone who poses a threat to religious and social order. Medieval people carried what amounted to religious identification in the form of knowledge that every Christian was expected to possess. They knew basic prayers in Latin, understood the religious calendar, could recite fundamental doctrines, and demonstrated their faith through automatic behaviors that were as natural as modern people checking their phones. Your inability to provide satisfactory evidence of proper religious education is raising serious red flags. The Church was particularly concerned about heretical movements that challenged orthodox teaching, undermined clerical authority, or encouraged behaviors that were seen as socially destructive. Medieval Europe had experienced numerous religious uprisings, reform movements, and heretical sects that had caused significant political and social disruption. The Cathars, Waldensians, and various apocalyptic movements had all challenged church authority in different ways, making religious officials constantly vigilant against new outbreaks of such problems. Your strange behavior, foreign appearance, and inability to demonstrate proper religious knowledge could easily be interpreted as evidence of heretical beliefs or contamination by foreign religious influences. Brother Augustine is trained to identify such problems, and his growing suspicion is evident in his increasingly pointed questions about your religious background and beliefs. The crowd that has been following your market adventures is now watching this religious interrogation with the fascination that medieval people reserved for public religious drama. Religious disputes were community entertainment, educational opportunities, and social bonding experiences all rolled into one. Everyone has an opinion about whether you're a genuine spiritual threat or simply an unfortunate soul in need of religious guidance. Public religious examinations served multiple purposes in medieval society. They educated the community about proper religious behavior, demonstrated the authority and vigilance of church officials, provided entertainment that was both morally acceptable and socially beneficial, and created opportunities for community bonding through shared judgment of deviant behavior. Medieval religious authority was also concerned with moral behavior, and your market activities have displayed several questionable aspects. Your apparent wealth, your willingness to engage in commerce without proper understanding of religious restrictions, and your association with various disreputable characters throughout the morning have created a pattern that suggests moral corruption or spiritual confusion. The Church taught that excessive concern with material wealth was spiritually dangerous, and your obvious focus on commercial activities rather than spiritual matters is another mark against you. Medieval people were expected to balance earthly concerns with heavenly priorities, and your behavior suggests someone whose priorities might be dangerously disordered. Medieval Christianity emphasized the spiritual dangers of commercial activity. Merchants were considered morally suspect because their work involved profit, competition, and the kind of worldly focus that could distract from spiritual concerns. The Church developed elaborate rules for commercial behavior that were designed to prevent merchants from falling into sin while still allowing necessary economic activity to continue. Brother Augustine is also concerned about the company you've been keeping, your interactions with known criminals, your acceptance of help from morally questionable individuals, and your general lack of discrimination in choosing associates suggests either naivety that requires correction or moral corruption that requires punishment. Medieval people believed that moral contamination could spread through association, making it dangerous to tolerate improper companions. The religious investigation is attracting the attention of secular authorities as well. Medieval church and state worked together to maintain social order, and religious problems often became political problems. Your growing reputation as a potential spiritual threat could easily escalate into secular legal difficulties that would make your current problems seem trivial by comparison. The relationship between church and secular law in medieval times was complex and sometimes contradictory, but both systems shared a commitment to maintaining social order through the enforcement of proper behavior. Religious authorities could request secular enforcement of their decisions, while secular authorities often deferred to church expertise in matters involving moral or spiritual issues. Brother Augustine is now consulting a small book that contains guidelines for dealing with various types of spiritual problems. Medieval clerics carried reference materials that helped them diagnose and treat different forms of religious deviation, moral corruption, and spiritual confusion. These books contained detailed descriptions of symptoms, recommended treatments, and procedures for handling different categories of problematic individuals. The examination is becoming more formal, with Brother Augustine asking specific questions designed to test your knowledge of basic Christian doctrine. He wants you to recite the Pater Noster, explain the significance of various religious holidays, and demonstrate your understanding of fundamental theological concepts that every properly educated Christian should know without difficulty. Medieval religious education was comprehensive and mandatory, delivered through a combination of formal instruction, community participation, and constant reinforcement through daily religious observances. People who couldn't demonstrate basic religious knowledge were considered either ignorant peasants who needed education or potential heretics who posed a threat to community spiritual welfare. Your obvious confusion and inability to provide satisfactory answers to these basic religious questions is creating a serious problem that goes beyond simple ignorance. Brother Augustine is beginning to suspect that you might represent a more serious threat to religious and social order than initially apparent. As Brother Augustine continues his spiritual cross-examination, and the crowd grows larger and more interested in the proceedings, you begin to realize that medieval religious authority wasn't just about personal salvation, it was about community conformity, social control, and maintaining the kind of religious and cultural uniformity that made medieval society function. Your obvious failure to meet basic standards of religious knowledge, moral behavior, and social conformity has marked you as a problem that requires official attention. Brother Augustine is now faced with the question of whether you're worth saving through education and penance or dangerous enough to require more drastic measures. The investigation is also revealing the extent to which medieval society was organized around religious assumptions that penetrated every aspect of daily life. Your inability to navigate these religious expectations isn't just inconvenient, it's potentially dangerous in a world where religious deviation could result in social ostracism, legal penalties, or worse. The afternoon sun is climbing toward its peak. Religious and secular authorities are taking increasing interest in your case, and your medieval market adventure is approaching what might charitably be called a spiritual crisis that could have very material consequences for your continued well-being. As the afternoon sun reaches its merciless peak and your various catastrophes begin to compound like interest on a medieval loan, you realize that your only viable strategy at this point is a dignified retreat from this commercial battlefield before you end up in the stocks, excommunicated, or worse. But extracting yourself from a medieval marketplace turns out to be almost as complicated as entering it, because by now you've managed to create such a spectacular series of disasters that half the market considers you entertainment, and the other half considers you a genuine threat to public order. Your attempts to leave gracefully are immediately complicated by the fact that you still owe money to various vendors for goods you've attempted to purchase, services you've inadvertently requested, and damages you've apparently caused through your ignorance of basic market protocols. Medieval commerce operated on complex systems of debt and obligation that couldn't simply be walked away from without social and potentially legal consequences. The baker is still expecting payment for the bread you pointed at earlier, even though the transaction was never completed due to your currency confusion. From his perspective, indicating interest in purchasing something created a commercial obligation that required resolution. Medieval people took such obligations seriously, and merchants had community support for collecting debts from customers who tried to avoid payment. The cloth merchant wants compensation for the fabric samples he allowed you to examine, arguing that your handling has reduced their value to other customers. Medieval textiles were expensive and delicate, and merchants protected their investments carefully. The concept of browsing without purchasing wasn't well established, and extensive examination of goods created expectations of sale. Martha the fishwife is demanding payment for the market space you've been occupying while conducting your various failed transactions. Even though you were never officially granted permission to use the space, your prolonged presence has prevented her from using it for her own commercial purposes, creating what medieval people would consider a legitimate claim for compensation. Your linguistic difficulties are making these departure negotiations even more complicated than they need to be. Every attempt to explain your situation, apologize for misunderstandings, or negotiate solutions runs into the same communication barriers that have been plaguing you all day. The vendors are losing patience with your inability to express yourself clearly, and their frustration is beginning to attract the kind of attention that makes peaceful resolution increasingly unlikely. The crowd that has been following your adventures is reluctant to let you leave because you've provided the best entertainment they've seen in months. Medieval markets were social centers where people came not just to conduct business but to catch up on news, gossip, and community events. Your spectacular incompetence has given them something to talk about for weeks to come, and they're not ready for the show to end. Medieval people had a different concept of privacy than modern people. Community events, including commercial disputes, personal problems, and social conflicts, were considered public entertainment and education. The idea that you might want to leave quietly and avoid further attention was foreign to people who expected their neighbors to witness, participate in, and learn from each other's experiences. Brother Augustine is still hovering nearby, clearly unconvinced that your spiritual problems have been resolved. Medieval religious authorities took their supervisory responsibilities seriously, and someone who had displayed as many signs of potential heresy, moral corruption, and social deviance as you have couldn't simply be allowed to disappear without proper resolution of the spiritual issues involved. The criminal elements who were targeting you earlier haven't given up their designs on your remaining wealth. Your attempts to leave are providing new opportunities for theft, fraud, and various confidence schemes designed to separate you from your money during the confusion of departure. Medieval criminals were persistent and creative, particularly when dealing with obviously vulnerable targets like yourself. The money changers are blocking your path with offers to convert your remaining currency into travel-friendly forms, exchange your local coins for foreign currency, or provide letters of credit for use in other markets. These services sound helpful until you realize that the exchange rates being offered would leave you with approximately enough purchasing power to buy a turnip and a blessing from a hedge priest. Historians still argue whether medieval money changers were legitimate businessmen providing necessary services or sophisticated criminals operating legal scams. But from your perspective, the distinction is academic. Either way, they're trying to take your money, and their persistence suggests they have no intention of letting you leave until they've succeeded. The market officials are also taking interest in your departure attempts. Your day-long disruption of normal market operations, combined with your obvious violations of various commercial regulations, has created a situation that requires official attention. Medieval authorities couldn't simply ignore someone who had caused as much chaos as you have without appearing weak or incompetent. The market reeve who earlier explained guild regulations is now approaching with what appears to be an official document, probably a list of fines, penalties, and obligations that you've incurred through your various market infractions. Medieval bureaucracy was surprisingly sophisticated when it came to documenting violations and collecting penalties, and your behavior has provided ample material for official action. Your attempts to explain that you're just trying to leave peacefully are being interpreted as resistance to authority, which adds new complications to an already complex situation. Medieval people expected deference to officials, prompt payment of obligations, and respectful acceptance of penalties. Your obvious frustration and desire to escape are being seen as signs of guilt and potential criminality. The guild representatives are also getting involved in your departure negotiations. Your attempts to engage in commerce without proper authorization have violated their territorial rights, and they want assurance that you understand the seriousness of your infractions and won't repeat them in the future. Medieval guilds protected their monopolies aggressively and didn't tolerate unauthorized competition, even from obviously incompetent amateurs. The social dynamics of medieval markets made individual departure difficult without community consensus. Your problems have become community property, and resolving them requires negotiation with multiple parties who all have different interests and expectations. Simply walking away would be seen as antisocial behavior that violated community norms and created obligations for others to pursue and apprehend you. Medieval people understood that individual actions had community consequences, and they expected problems to be resolved publicly through processes that involved all affected parties. Your desire for private resolution of your difficulties conflicts with community expectations of public accountability and social participation. The late afternoon sun is creating longer shadows that provide some relief from the heat, but also signal the approaching end of the market day. Medieval markets typically operated during daylight hours, and vendors were beginning to think about closing their stalls and securing their goods. Your continued presence is interfering with normal market shutdown procedures. The approaching evening also brings new concerns about safety and security. Medieval towns became more dangerous after dark, and people who were still conducting business when the market closed were often viewed with suspicion. Your inability to resolve your affairs during normal market hours is creating additional concerns about your intentions and competence. You're beginning to understand that your medieval market experience isn't just about commerce, it's about community membership, social participation, and cultural conformity that extends far beyond simple buying and selling. Your failures aren't just personal problems. They're community disruptions that require collective resolution. The various officials, vendors, criminals, and bystanders who have been involved in your day-long adventure all have stakes in how your departure is handled. Their expectations, obligations, and interests create a complex web of relationships that can't be untangled simply by walking away from the marketplace. Medieval society was organized around concepts of mutual obligation, community responsibility, and collective accountability that made individual autonomy much more limited than modern people expect. Your problems have become everyone's problems, and solving them requires community participation and consensus. As the market day winds down and your situation becomes increasingly desperate, you realize that your medieval adventure has taught you something profound about the differences between modern and medieval society. The individualism, privacy, and personal autonomy that modern people take for granted simply didn't exist in medieval communities where every person's actions affected everyone else. Your attempts to navigate medieval commerce as an individual consumer interacting with individual vendors has collided with a social system based on community relationships, collective responsibility, and mutual obligation. The marketplace isn't just an economic institution, it's a social organism where every participant has defined roles, established relationships, and community obligations. The sun is beginning to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the cobblestones and creating the golden light that makes medieval markets look romantic in paintings but does nothing to resolve your very practical problems with debt, authority, and community expectations. Your medieval market adventure is approaching its conclusion, but the challenges of extraction are proving to be as complex and dangerous as everything else you've encountered in this strange world where commerce was warfare, community was survival, and individual freedom was a luxury that few people could afford. The market day is ending, but your problems are far from over, and the approaching darkness brings new challenges that will test your survival skills in ways that daylight commerce never could. Medieval nights were dangerous for everyone, but particularly for foreigners who didn't understand the rules, lacked community protection, and had already demonstrated their inability to navigate basic social systems. As evening approaches and the market begins its transformation from commercial center to something altogether more mysterious and threatening, you realize that surviving the medieval marketplace was only the first challenge in what promises to be a very long and difficult journey through a world that makes no allowances for confusion, incompetence, or modern sensibilities. The marketplace is growing quieter now, as vendors pack their goods and customers complete their final transactions. But the quiet isn't peaceful, it's the calm before whatever storm awaits people who can't find their place in medieval society when the sun goes down and the real dangers emerge from the shadows. Your day in the medieval marketplace is drawing to a close, but your education in medieval survival has only just begun. The lessons you've learned about commerce, community, and cultural expectations will serve you well in the challenges that lie ahead, assuming you can survive long enough to apply them. Sweet dreams, modern traveler. Try not to think too hard about how medieval people managed to create a functioning society when simply buying bread required navigating currency systems that would challenge a modern economist, guild regulations that would frustrate a contemporary lawyer, and social expectations that would exhaust a professional diplomat. Rest easy knowing that your medieval market adventure, however disastrous, has given you a deeper appreciation for the complexity, sophistication, and sheer difficulty of daily life in a world where every transaction was a negotiation, every interaction was a performance, and every day was a test of social, economic, and spiritual survival skills that modern people can barely imagine. The medieval marketplace, with all its chaos, danger, and bewildering complexity, was actually a remarkable achievement of human organization, a place where people from different social classes, economic backgrounds, and geographic regions could come together to conduct the business that kept their communities alive and thriving, despite the countless obstacles that made simple commerce and adventure worthy of epic poetry. So close your eyes, let the gentle sounds of the modern world wash over you, and be grateful that your shopping experiences involve nothing more challenging than comparing prices, checking reviews, and finding parking spaces. The medieval marketplace awaits no more customers today, and you can rest assured that you'll never have to navigate its commercial battlefield again.